One Piece owes a great debt to the many series that inspired its existence. Author Eiichiro Oda has cited Vicky the Viking, Captain Tsubasa, and of course the Dragon's Balls as key sources for what began this epicsome journey. However, arguably there is no series more responsible for the unprecedented success of One Piece than Naruto. Which are not my words, these are Eiichiro Oda's words, as well as the author of Naruto, Masashi Kishimoto, who got together to conduct a series of interviews in 2015 to celebrate the end of Naruto, during which both authors acknowledged that neither series would have been anywhere near as great as they are today without the other. And specifically with One Piece, we would be very unlikely to have Gear 5th without a key Naruto inspiration that completely changed Oda's view on Luffy. But in these interviews, Oda and Kishimoto initially reminisce on the time it is that they first met, which was at a Shonen Jump New Year's party in 1999. One Piece had been in publication for 2 years at this point, whilst Naruto had only been running for a handful of months. And according to Kishimoto's own words, he was a bit awestruck by Oda's talent and addressed him as Oda-sensei, but Oda swiftly told him to knock it off because they were the same age. And also because Oda was already aware of Kishimoto's work and greatly admired him. And in fact, Oda had been well aware of Kishimoto since long before the Naruto. Oda had been reading Kishimoto's one-shots and also the ill-fated Karakuri manga, which featured a Sasuke prototype protagonist. But unfortunately, or I guess actually, fortunately, Karakuri was cancelled almost immediately. But even at this early day, Oda considered Kishimoto to be a key rival, which swiftly developed into friendship. Oda stated to Kishimoto in the interview, "In terms of our manga, there was a little sense of competition, but when I actually met you, you turned out to be the nicest, kindest person. And it didn't matter to me anymore whose manga was more popular. I couldn't possibly fight with you." And Kishimoto identifies one of the reasons why they got along so well is because they understood each other's struggles. They were the same age and they were both fighting for their lives weekly in the surprisingly brutal world of manga production. But it wasn't just an understanding, because they were more or less in the same starting position. Oda got going a little quicker, but Oda and Kishimoto used each other to strive to get better. Whenever a great chapter of One Piece came out, it inspired Kishimoto to work harder on Naruto, and whenever a great Naruto chapter came out, it was the same for Oda. And on this, Oda said, "I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to compete with Naruto. The thing I'm most thankful for is that he, being Kishimoto, made it so competitive. Of all of the weekly comics and all of the comics in the world, the one that made me work the hardest was Naruto, hands down. So I'm really fortunate actually that he made it so difficult for me. That kind of experience is rare." Kishimoto shared the same sentiment and then said that he doesn't think anyone puts as much detail into every panel as Oda does. To which Oda objected by pointing out every time that Kishimoto uses a shadow clone jutsu and the wild amount of drawing and detailed work that creating an army of clones as one of the primary abilities of the main protagonist must be. I think it should also be noted that they were referring to specifically weekly shonen manga, just before everyone points out in the comments, "Oh, like Berserk has so much more detail than both of those." Just like chill about that. But I do think that Kishimoto sums up their dynamic best with the following: "The problem is whether you have enough energy. But seeing you, being Oda, face the workload head on makes me feel like doing my best too." And weirdly enough, both authors think that the other one had a harder job for different reasons. In Kishimoto's case, I guess I should first point out that in the West, Naruto utterly dominated One Piece. And arguably, I'd say that Naruto is still to this day more popular in the West. However, this was a very different story in Japan. Almost since its inception, One Piece has held the #1 best-selling manga spot for most of its run, including an absolutely crazy decade where it was the best-selling series in each year from 2008 to 2018. A couple of series were able to take the crown from One Piece on the odd occasion, Death Note and Nana in the early days. And in more recent days, we've got the Demon Slayers, your Jujutsu Kaisens, and your Blue Locks. They've also managed to take the crown, but never Naruto, and that is why Kishimoto had the following to say about his competition with Oda. "I still think I had it easier. Oda was always at the top, and I feel like that comes with its own unique troubles and hardships. All that pressure and stress would have given me ulcers." And Oda actually disagreed there. He thought that Kishimoto had a harder job, and that's because Kishimoto had the pressure of differentiating his series from both One Piece and from Dragon Ball, which was still very fresh in the minds of shonen readers in the 90s. Whereas Oda, he had the advantage of just needing to start his series differentiating from Dragon Ball and that alone. And also by that logic, we should also just pour one out for Bleach while we're here, which had to differentiate itself from Dragon Ball, One Piece, and Naruto. Definitely not an easy thing to do at the time. Here's the really important part about this rivalry though, and the key that led to the shared success of both One Piece and Naruto. Oda said, "Usually when you have two manga series in the same genre, they compete for the same audience. But Kishimoto figured out how to keep Naruto and One Piece from overlapping too much. Take colors, for instance. Luffy uses a lot of red, so he went with a different color scheme for Naruto. There's hardly a touch of red in Naruto. He went out of his way to make sure that they wouldn't encroach on one another. And Kishimoto replied, "It was a trial and error process for sure. Oda was writing a story of high adventure, so I had to stay away from that. That's why I had Naruto come back to the village every time he left on a mission. Also, Luffy gradually enlists a lot of friends in One Piece, so I thought Naruto should have his companions around from the beginning." And that right there is one of the biggest changes that this rivalry resulted in. Whenever I reference the One Piece story style, the narrative flow, which is always pushing forward to a new location, we don't circle back. Most of the time we don't circle back. Sometimes we do. But whenever I mention that, I have a tendency to compare it directly to Naruto because Kishimoto does the exact opposite. With One Piece, it's always on to the next island. With Naruto, it's always, we're going to go out, we're going to come back. We're going to go out, we're going to come back. We're going to go out, and we're going to come back. And it is very cool to find out that that structure was not only purposeful, but engineered as a direct contrast to One Piece. And this went in both directions as well, with Oda recounting a very important change it is that he had to make. That reminds me of one time I had to avoid something from Naruto. Sanji's name was originally supposed to be Naruto, but the instant your manga came out, I knew it was going to be running for a long time. So I changed his name at the last moment. And before we go more into that change, I just want to linger on the degree of respect that was expressed there. Because this isn't immediately apparent, but Oda is not talking about the actual Naruto manga. Sanji was introduced almost a full year before the first chapter of Naruto was even published. What Oda is referring to here is the Naruto one-shot, a pilot chapter that Kishimoto drew in 1997, just after One Piece had started serialization. So Oda saw this one-shot that didn't even have a green light for a full series yet, and wouldn't for 2 more years, and Oda just knew that it was gonna be a long-running series, which way back in the 90s was a lot rarer than it is today. Part of the reason why One Piece, Naruto, and Bleach were called the Big Three is because of how extremely unusual it was to have 3 popular long-running manga in the same genre being published in Weekly Shonen Jump at the same time. So Oda's early faith in Naruto is quite touching, but also mildly annoying for him because it forced Oda to change Sanji's name. Just imagine what could have been. We could have been dealing with Vinsmoke Naruto. But Oda did this as a professional courtesy because yes, he could have fought for the Naruto name, because as the author of One Piece, Oda had the bigger and weightier dick that he could slam down on the table at any given moment, but he didn't want to put a talent like Kishimoto in a tough position, so Oda himself altered course instead. In this interview, Kishimoto also said that if Oda had gone with Naruto if he had fought for the name, then Kishimoto would have changed the name into something else ramen related, like Menma or Shinachiku. But with Kishimoto, the running theme tends to be that it's not so much what One Piece inspired him to do, but the guardrails One Piece provided for him to not do. For example, Kishimoto stated that he was incredibly jealous when Oda began drawing the Skypiea arc, because Kishimoto loves clouds and the sky in general, but after seeing Oda do it, he kept Naruto very purposely and literally grounded. Oda himself had a very different philosophy on this though. If he saw something in Naruto that really impressed him, it would often go on to directly inspire One Piece. With the primary example of this being Luffy's Gear 3rd, but also his inflation in Gear 4th and becoming a full-on giant in Gear 5th. Without Naruto, we might not have any of this. As in the interview, Oda states that he was struck by reading a point where Choji uses the partial multi-size technique, which allows him to increase the size of specific body parts, and after seeing Choji with a giant fist, Oda wanted to do the same thing with Luffy. But he did check with Kishimoto first because Oda did say, and I quote, "Hey, I'm kind of copying your style here," which Kishimoto was fine with. He didn't think it was a big deal. And that may have something to do with the original multi-size technique being a little bit extraordinarily similar to Luffy's balloon ability. And given how carefully Kishimoto was thinking about One Piece, he definitely would have known that when he drew it. And I think this just goes to show the compound relationship here of 2 authors being inspired by and being able to build off one another. But quite frankly, as One Piece fans, we owe a great debt to Naruto, especially Choji of all people in particular. Oda also went on to say that he is a big fan of Kishimoto's drawing style because Kishimoto draws with animation in mind, and so he employs a lot of effects that wouldn't even cross the minds of most other mangaka. And in particular, Oda noted this image of a character named Taiseki, and if this invisible-looking ninjaman seems familiar, it's because Oda was so inspired by seeing this that he wanted to have a go at creating his own invisible character, which ended up being Absalom and later on Shiryu. In fact, it's entirely possible that the invisible fruit is only still relevant today because Oda wanted to preserve the effect and draw it again. Oda and Kishimoto also acknowledge their use of colors in general. Where One Piece goes for more boldly vibrant primary colors, Naruto tends to use a lot of elegant muted colors. And Kishimoto said, "The way you use colors in One Piece is so complicated. I could never do that. That's your secret weapon, I think. I've read lots of manga and I've never seen anyone use colors like you. I thought maybe it was just a natural talent you had, but it's something you've been consciously working towards. It's amazing." And of course, each author was asked about their favorite characters in each series, with Oda's favorite Naruto characters being Rock Lee and Might Guy. He loves the way that Kishimoto draws all that quote kung fu action, but I think it's because there's something distinctly Luffy in Rock Lee in particular. He's a very straightforward boy with a very simply drawn face and endless determination to overcome any obstacle. He's very Luffy coded. However, when Kishimoto was asked who his favorite character is, he gave a surprise mention to Bellamy of all people. Kishimoto just loves his attitude and his spring ability, and I do think that some of this may have been recency bias because Bellamy had just been reintroduced to One Piece as Dressrosa was ongoing when this interview was published. However, Kishimoto then revealed that his true favorite character is one Tony Chopper because of how touched he was by the Sakura Snow moment at the end of Drum Island, which prompted Oda to reveal something pretty wild, which was that Chopper was originally going to be an almost purely comic relief character. Chopper was originally envisaged as a bipedal smoking reindeer cracking them jokes all the time, which we can see pretty clearly in his prototype Straw Hat sketch, and it's almost as if Chopper would have become the kind of character that Brook is today, just sort of hanging out in the background and making people smile whenever he can. However, by the time that Oda got to Drum Island, a lot of Chopper's original intention was already covered by the gag quirks of each other character, so Oda transformed him into a smaller, cuter, and more genuinely heartfelt character. And Chopper's existence is cited by Kishimoto as part of why he never seriously tried drawing a mascot character for Naruto, because Chopper would be impossible to top, and Kishimoto also said that he is quite jealous of Chopper. But my favorite part of this interview is when the two of them discuss the tributes they did for one another at the end of Naruto. So if you're unaware, when Naruto's final chapter was published, Oda put a Naruto reference in One Piece and Kishimoto put a One Piece reference in Naruto. Oda stated that Kishimoto's media coordinator at the end of the manga actually used to be my editor. So I approached him in private and told him that I have to do something special for the end of Naruto. And that something special ended up being the cover of chapter 766, featuring Luffy eating ramen with the one and only Naruto. And if you pause to look at this image long enough, you'll see an endless amount of Naruto references, like obviously Nami's outfit being absolutely slathered in hidden leaf symbols. But my favorite reference that goes over a lot of people's heads would be the menu items on the wall. As if you read the first character of every menu item, it spells out a secret message saying, "Naruto, otsukare-sama deshita," which roughly translates as "thanks for the great run, Naruto." And funnily enough, according to their interview, everyone saw the secret message except for Kishimoto himself. And it was Kishimoto's brother who had to call him and say, "Mate, look a little bit closer." And another small element noted by Oda is that Naruto and Luffy are trading their trademark foods. So Luffy's eating ramen, whilst Naruto is eating a very One Piece hunk of meat. And Oda pointed out how rare it is for Luffy to give away his meat, so there's some pretty extreme respect here being shown on this cover page. And Kishimoto responded to it as follows. Also, the title of that chapter of One Piece is Smile. That put a lump in my throat. I know a lot of people who enjoyed that illustration, but I was happiest of all. And there was actually a much larger plan originally to celebrate the end of Naruto that Oda was unable to implement. The week that Naruto ended was chapter 766, which took place during Trafalgar Law's flashback, and what Oda was originally going to do was sneak in hidden references and a message for Kishimoto all through the flashback in the actual story, not just the cover pages. But Oda did the chapter maths and realized that Naruto would finish before Law's flashback. So he abandoned the more complex plan and settled for this instead. Of course, it wasn't just Oda though. As stated before, Kishimoto also had special plans for his final chapter, and to pay tribute to one of his greatest rivals and one of his greatest friends, Kishimoto defaced Naruto's carving into Hokage Rock with a straw hat Jolly Roger. And according to this interview, Oda was a little worried about that at first, because he thought that Naruto fans might get a bit angry, as in context, this is pretty much the final image of the entire series, and the most eye-catching part of it is such an obvious One Piece reference, which isn't hidden away in a little corner or anything. This is a full-page illustration, but in the end, it went down quite well, especially because both authors were paying tribute to one another. And I think it summarizes a lot of what we've discussed in this video. The idea that One Piece wouldn't be where it is today without Naruto, and that Naruto Naruto wouldn't have become what it was without One Piece. Both authors spent 15 years pushing one another to greater and greater heights. So slapping the Straw Hat Jolly Roger on Naruto's face is quite symbolic of the impact that Oda had on Kishimoto, and I would not be surprised if, when the final chapter of One Piece does come out, Oda acknowledges this relationship as well by putting a Naruto reference into it, which is all very well and lovely, and maybe this is just how chronically online I am, but I so often see on the internet One Piece and Naruto fans viciously arguing with one another about which series is better, whose characters could beat whose writing was trasher, and which series had a bigger impact where, etc. You've got people ripping each other to shreds over fictional pirates and fictional ninjas, and it's so weird because the actual authors are the best of friends, and they've spent most of their careers doing nothing but encouraging one another. I guess it would just be nice if we were a bit more like them. But prior to closing this out, Kishimoto had one very important anecdote to share about Oda, which was, there was one time, I can't remember when, but I asked you in private about your whole approach to writing manga. I wanted to know how you really felt about it. And you said, it's really not about drawing well. It's about challenging yourself every time you do it. That's how you should approach it. And that really impressed me. And that is the story of how two of history's greatest manga authors catapulted each other into stratospheric success through rivalry and, in classic shonen style, through friendship.